to border, from coast to coast. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Happy Thursday. And a lot of people would look at today and say, man, it's great today. It's going to be over 60 degrees where I'm at. I don't know. It kind of creeps me out because I remember December 11th, not that many years ago, and we played hockey outdoors. We'd had several below zero days. And I know you can't conflate, you can't confuse weather with climate. And I have a tendency to do it. And I guess it's all too coincidental because the climate scientists that were warning about the warming many years ago, again, yeah, that's what they were talking. They didn't say it was going to get colder. They said it was going to get warmer. Well, okay. Once bitten, twice shy. I'm kind of believing them because it's happening. And so what's to follow? Well, that's along the lines of climate. Today, we're going to be talking about water. And you probably have seen, and I've had this on the show a number of times here. I've tried to make people understand what's going on. Don't look down. You remember the movie Don't Look Up? Well, don't look down. Don't look underground. We're going to be talking about groundwater today. We've been talking about, the rivers and streams and the fields and the runoff and all of that situation a lot on the show. But today we're going to be talking about groundwater. And I don't know, kind of creeps me out, folks. We're going to be talking with our guest today, who is Dr. Keith Schilling. I hope you saw the promo. Let me bring that up on stage. I work a lot on these promos. There it is. Rivers and wells run dry. Don't look down again. So here's his live line graphic. Dr. Keith Schilling is the state geologist and director of the Iowa Geological Survey. He has a BA from Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, an MS in water resources from Iowa State University, and a PhD in geology from the University of Iowa. He started his career following his MS for the Iowa DNR and their contaminated site program. He then became a consultant for an environmental consulting company in Des Moines, working on Superfund type contaminated sites. I think I might know where that site's located. We'll ask him. He moved to Iowa City and joined the IGS in 1998. He is a professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Iowa. And he is standing by. Let's click over here, click a button, and say good morning to our new friend here, Dr. Keith Schilling. Hi, Doc.
Oh, good morning.
Thanks for coming in here. I mentioned that is that the DICO site? Were you involved in taking a look at that?
Not really. Believe it or not, there are more Superfund sites than that across the state. So I worked on one in the Cedar Rapids area, but there were plenty to go around. It's an interesting time. I mean, it's a whole other tangent we could go down, but
yeah,
it was an interesting time in the mid to late 80s where people were just discovering like the Love Canal kind of contamination. And so there were a lot of sites that got brought to attention and a lot of them have kind of faded away. DICO, on the other hand, has been around for a long time. That was one of the first ones in Iowa that made that Superfund list.
Yeah, I got to digress a little bit. Mention one of the reasons that jumped out at me. I've got a connection to DICO through my father. He was a truck driver for DICO. We're talking, oh my God, 60 years ago, folks. And as a lad, I spent a little time on the DICO site. So I've got a special affinity for those folks. My dad did not like that company, by the way. He spit on the ground when he talked about DICO. But that's the topic for another day. I want to talk about, as I mentioned, the, don't look down, don't look around, don't look underground situation in the state of Iowa. Let's start there. I talk about this all the time on my show because I'm talking about climate, war, and healthcare. And it's frustrating to me oftentimes that people don't pay closer attention to these big issues that I think are life and death and are the looming biggest issues that we'll ever confront as a nation and perhaps as humankind. And this water stuff fits into that category. Now, you've devoted your life study to this as a geologist. Do you feel the same way? Do you feel that we're giving, enough notice to this very critical issue?
I don't think so. I don't think so either. And there's a popular kind of convention that future wars are going to be fought over water.
Yeah.
So it links that, and then there's this other side of the healthcare, like what's the quality of our water, and what are the impacts on human health with high concentrations of things in the water. So it's like, in one way, water links all this stuff, all the topics of your podcast.
Yeah, water is life. Now, we're going to be featuring a lot of coverage from the Des Moines Register. They've been getting to it. You recently had an op ed piece there. I mean, they've been covering it right along. I don't think
Mhm.
they're getting it high enough, on the page, so to speak. If they were still doing banner headlines, I would have banner headlines every day on climate, war, and healthcare. And of course, water would fit into that category. I know people are concerned about a lot of other things, football games and stuff like that. But folks, I'm telling you something. If we're not alive, football games aren't going to get played. Let me bring this up on screen here and talk about this a little bit to start. To kind of give us some context here, I started off talking about climate. Climate Central, a nonprofit comprised of independent scientists and communicators who research and report on climate change, ranked Iowa among the top 3 U.S. states most vulnerable to drought in a 2020 study. South Dakota ranked among the top 5 as well. And I hope people can see that map. It gives you an idea of what we're talking about. And it makes these issues with the surface water, the lakes and streams and ponds and lakes, and then the groundwater, all that more important, Doc, because we're so vulnerable to drought in this part of the country.
Yeah, I don't know what the criteria was for that ranking, so can't comment specifically about it. I do know in Iowa, our drought vulnerability, even though we're low water with the current drought, more focused on eastern Iowa, our vulnerability to future drought is not very evenly distributed across the state. So northwest, southwest, southern Iowa are way more vulnerable to drought compared to eastern Iowa and northeast Iowa. And it has to do with our groundwater supplies, where the water comes from, what are our surface and bedrock aquifers. So to lump the entire state of Iowa as vulnerable, maybe it's, I don't know, because I do see the vulnerability for sure in all of western Iowa and southern Iowa. It is,
Yeah.
without question, they are extremely vulnerable, and that includes Des Moines. Yeah.
And that likens, I mean, that's what they're talking about when they liken this right now to the Dust Bowl. Because I'm getting to be an old boy. I've been around a long time. I've seen a lot of droughts. I've seen a lot of cycles, but I haven't seen anything like this in the part of state that I reside in. And it's one of those drought-stricken areas that the doc is referring to. Let me bring this up on screen. I don't know if that's big enough that you can see it, but I'm sure you've seen this map before. This is the Jordan Aquifer. Talk about this, because when I was a kid, I don't know, I kind of had a dumb idea. I thought, well, the Jordan Aquifer is like a river that runs underground. But looking at this, it strikes me that it's a little bit more like a pond or a big lake, maybe underground.
Yeah. So the Jordan Aquifer is it does cover the entire state, as you can see in the figure, and it's a deep bedrock aquifer. So this is going to be an aquifer that drought impacts more indirectly, because as things get drier, people use more water lawns, all that sort of stuff, and we get increased usage of groundwater during a drought. But that Jordan aquifer, if you're in the Des Moines area, is roughly 1,500 feet to 2,000 feet below ground. So this is one that's separated by a lot of confining units and is not really connected to the current climate as much as our alluvial sand and gravel aquifers are. So the Jordan aquifer actually crops out above the land surface in northeast Iowa, then it dips to the southwest. And it's used across the state. It's a very productive and permeable aquifer, but it is deeply buried. And the recharge to that aquifer occurs over thousands and thousands to millennia years.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit, that aquifer is vulnerable because it's not getting replenished in our human lifetime. That water in that aquifer, we've tried to date it. It's tens to hundreds of thousands of years old. So think about that, where a water that you're pulling out of the ground to drink or to wash your car or to whatever could have been recharged 100,000 years ago, up to 1,000,000 years old. You know,
Yeah.
does that influence your use of that water? If you think about that's not coming back. We had one
Yes.
chance to use it, and it's not coming back. You know,
Yeah.
so
I'm
that's
gonna
the
get.
unique feature about the Jordan aquifer. It's definitely vulnerable to overuse, and overuse oftentimes increases with drought and other industrial uses.
All right, good. We're going to get into a lot of that. Let me read through some of these articles here, and I've got some questions, some highlights that I want to ask Dr. Schilling about. Let's see here if I can bring this up. Now, this is from the Associated Press. The cost of building an artificial intelligence product like Chat GPT can be hard to measure. What's that? The Microsoft-backed OpenAI needed for its technology uses lots of water, folks, pulled from the watershed of the Raccoon and Des Moines rivers in central Iowa to cool a powerful supercomputer as it helped teach its AI systems how to mimic human writing. I looked at that and I'm like, I highlighted that because how important is that? For much of the year, Iowa's weather is cool enough for Microsoft to use outside air to keep the supercomputer running properly and vent heat out of the building. Only when the temperature reaches 29.3 degrees Celsius, now that's about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. That ain't that hot. 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Does it withdraw water? The company has said in a public disclosure. That can still be a lot of water, especially in the summer. In July 2022, the month before OpenAI says it completed its training of GPT-4, Microsoft pumped in about 11.5 million gallons of water to its cluster of Iowa data centers. According to the West Des Moines Water Works, that amounted to about 6% of all the water used in the district, which also supplies drinking water to the city's residents. Now, this probably isn't your area of expertise, Doc, but I've asked some people about this, and I didn't really get a good answer. Do you know, once that water is used for cooling, what becomes of it? Does it become recycled within the facility? Does it go back into the river? Does it end up underground in some way? Do you have any idea what happens to that water?
I don't know for sure. I believe they probably have a water discharge permit. So when the heat, they can't use the water for cooling anymore. It's a little too warm. They'll discharge it to the stream. So
Oh,
yeah, that's in all likelihood. I don't see them recycling that water necessarily. So
yeah. I didn't think it was being recycled. That's
yeah,
where
the
it's
thing
from.
about these data centers is they'll use as much water as a medium-sized town. You know, like some of these,
Yeah.
it's like you don't really think about that. You know, you think about water and drinking and whatever you do in human life. You don't think about it just for being used for cooling, and the fact that you have this this completely enclosed building that's using as much water as a medium-sized town.
Yeah. And again, you have to put it in context. For what? I look at hell. I use Facebook. I use YouTube. I mean, I like the Ethernet, but to mimic human writing for artificial intelligence and AI strikes me as being like Skynet anyway. Well,
Yeah.
let's move on here because I want to get to some other things here with the doc. Now, this is from the Des Moines Register. The growing water use threatens to strain the Jordan aquifer that we've been talking about. Let me bring this up on screen large here so that I can read it here. And this was just last month. Rapidly growing industrial and residential use of the Jordan aquifer is prompting Iowa environmental, geez, I can't talk this morning, Iowa environmental leaders to consider new restrictions to better protect the massive underground water source. Okay, every word means something. New restrictions to better protect the massive underground water source. The Jordan aquifer provides drinking water to about 500,000 Iowans, as well as water that is critical to industries that range from data centers to food processing and ethanol production. Yeah, huge amounts of water. The recommendations are designed to warn users that Iowa's now rich water levels could decline enough in the years ahead that they could hinder job creation and economic development efforts if not managed carefully. Okay, Doc, I wanted to bring you back in here because I'm a big lefty. I mean, the focus of my podcast is left-wing news and politics. I'm trying to be a small part of the fabric of independent left-wing media here, and I really skew that way. Okay, I look at this type of thing and I think, water for job creation and economic development, is that the priority here? Or is it life? Is it humanity? How do you look at it? Are you more concerned about economics and industry, or are you more concerned about the folks?
I'm not going to quite go maybe as far as you went on that. I mean, it's clearly life wins. That's not really open to debate. And there's some value for economic use of Iowa where it's sustainable. I keep going back to this idea that our water is not evenly distributed across the state. So if you go to, eastern Iowa, that's underlain by more permeable bedrock formations, limestone, dolomite, a lot of fractures, a lot of water yield there. You know what? They could sustain more active pumping and use of that water for economic purposes, because every time it rains, it recharges. If you go other areas, if it doesn't rain for a while, all you've done is deplete that resource, and it's going to take a while to fill. And so there is a balance between use of that water and making it a beneficial use for all of society, not just human health. That's by far the most important, but there are other beneficial uses. So I don't think we stop using water. Water is available for a lot of purposes. We just have to be smarter and maybe more, cognizant of the fact that, we have to be careful with how we manage these supplies. And I think that's what the Joint Register article is getting at. We need to make sure that we're using it in a sustainable way, and not necessarily for, overuse or over allocated for things that don't have as much value.
Yeah, okay, that's well said. Let me bring this up on screen here again so that I can read it. In its latest environmental report, Microsoft disclosed that its global water consumption spiked 34% from 2021 to 2022 to nearly 1.7 billion gallons, or more than 2,500 Olympic-sized swimming pools, a sharp increase compared to previous years that outside researchers tie to its AI research that I was talking about earlier. Now, the Jordan Aquifer runs underneath most of the state, ranging from 2,500 feet underground in southwest Iowa to near the surface in northeast Iowa. I didn't realize that. I knew it was deep, and I knew some of those, 1,000-foot levels that the doctor was talking about, but it's near the surface in northeast Iowa. Iowans also rely on other shallow aquifers, rivers, and lakes for water. The aquifer also provides water to parts of 6 other states. I did not know that, including big metro areas such as Milwaukee, Minneapolis, and Chicago. Okay, Doc, when I look at that, I think, my God, this thing, I talked about a big pond, a big lake. This is a huge amount of water under there. Has it been measured? Do you have a way or do you just estimate, or how do you know how much water's down there?
Yeah, I mean, there's, this is getting science nerdy and all, but you know the thickness of that aquifer, something about the permeability or the pores in that aquifer, and you could just do fairly either back of the envelope or sophisticated modeling to know essentially how much water in cubic, millions of cubic meters or gallons are available there. So from geology, you map the extent of these aquifers, and that's been done, as you can see, from across this entire region. That very first map you showed indicates that. And then based on the properties of that aquifer, how much water it contains, and then you work back from there. The key part, and I've tried to emphasize in some of my other writings, was you need to know, your checking account or your savings balance, how much is there. Let's think about a checking account. How much is in your checking account? You have bills to pay. That's your groundwater pumping, depleting that aquifer. And you get a paycheck every once in a while. Well, that goes into the checking account. So what you need to know is it's not just how much is there, but it's how much is being recharged and how much is leaving with pumping and other discharge. So, you know, all of this idea of balancing your checkbook is really sustainability. How sustainable is that aquifer for use? So if you have a lot of recharge coming in the aquifer, your checkbook is really active. You know, you can pull stuff out, pull water out when you need it because it's always getting replenished. If you don't, as the checkbook dries up, you know, your paychecks dry up. All you're doing is depleting your checking account, depleting your aquifer, and lowering the potential for that aquifer to supply water. So that's where it's like, you know, it depends on how actively replenished that aquifer is to know, like these conversations about Microsoft and AI, like in the right area, you know, it's a pretty active recharge circulation system. It's probably not a big deal, you know, like, because every time it rains, if it's in a rainy spot, like in Northwest, Seattle, every time it rains, you got recharge into the aquifer. That water is either going to flood or discharge across the surface water, or it's going to feed the streams as base flow, and it's going to leave your system, you know. Why not use it? You know, so in areas where, like the desert Southwest, I think it makes no sense whatsoever. You know, like all they're doing is depleting their checkbook or their long-term savings account with very little additions to it, and all it's going to do is make this current problem even worse in the future.
Just got a question in here from a viewer. I like to include these. This is from Tim. He says, "What is the current level or percent used of the Jordan aquifer, and how fast is it being consumed? How do you measure the level?" Okay, well, that's kind of what we were just talking about. You know, the climate scientists are measuring this degree and a half Celsius. I mean, they know exactly what's going on there with the temperature climb, you know, the melting of the icebergs and that type of thing. And the aquifer, Jordan aquifer, can be recharged. Now, my experience, Doc, is with a shallow well. I mean, I grew up on a farm with a 25-foot well. It rained, you know, the well filled back up. But the aquifer, if it's down there 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet, even deeper than that, how long does it take to recharge? And can you put a percentage? How much short is it right now compared to a normal, or is there a normal?
Yeah. Okay. Lots of questions there.
Yeah.
We know a little bit about pre-development levels in that aquifer because when they were first drilled, so this is an aquifer that's under pressure. Okay, so that water in that aquifer, unlike a sand and gravel that comes up relative to the atmospheric, open to the atmosphere, this is a confined aquifer. So there's a lot of, like, I wash my hands, there's a lot of layers on top of that. And that water, any water that enters into it has to percolate through 1,000, 2,000 feet of aquifer materials before it enters the top of the aquifer. And so that takes a lot of time, you know. And again, I said we tried to date this aquifer. It's a minimum of, say, tens of thousands of years. And depending on the assumptions you use, it could be upwards of 500,000 to 1 million years old. Okay. So it's really old. It takes a lot of time for that water to come in. Since it's under pressure, and I hate to get all technical here, but that pressure level rises to a certain level in that aquifer. As we pump from it, what we've done is lowered the pressure level in that aquifer. So that water is still there. It just takes a lot more energy. It takes deeper wells, and it's all becomes increasingly inefficient to pull that water out. So we've compared to the pre-development levels, or levels that were measured in 1975 as a benchmark, the water level pressure in that aquifer has gone down a couple hundred feet or more. So that tells you that, 50 years ago or 40 years ago, one well, you have to pump in some areas an additional head of pressure to more than 200 feet more to try and lift that water out of the ground now than you did before. And that extra, head that you got to pump against is electrical cost, it's power, and power is CO2. So it's all related that way. But we're not necessarily drying the aquifer out. We're just lowering the pressure level in that aquifer to make it more expensive and so forth to get out.
Well, it's amazing to me. I've always been amazed at how much oil there is below the surface of the earth. My God, the amount of oil that we have used since the industrial age began. I can't believe there's still oil in the ground, but there appears to be lots of it in places, and they're preparing to drill for it. I'm also amazed at the quantity of water that's in the Jordan aquifer and in other places. And we've been talking mostly about quantity. Let's talk about quality. I know as the water table lowers, the quality of water isn't as great as it was. But how about contamination? Our surface streams and lakes, and you can't even let your dog go swimming. I mean, they close beaches in the summertime. The Native Americans used to drink out of the rivers and streams above ground. What about below ground? What's happening down there?
Yeah, we're seeing, long term, in some cases, increasing impacts of typically non-point source pollution entering into the water surface, into the groundwater level. To backtrack just a little bit, I think we want to be clear that we're talking, the Jordan aquifer is very deep, and it's under a lot of different constraints than the water table. The water table is simply a measure of, if you anywhere on this in the state or in the country, in the world, actually, you drill down at some point, all the soil pores are entirely filled with water. That's the water table. That's the water surface. If you go across Iowa, invariably it's within 20 feet. Rise or falls, depends on where you are in the landscape. But say within 20 feet, you're going to reach the water table. Now, that water table is not necessarily water that's consumable or yields enough water for any sort of use. Sometimes it's in that fine-grained glacial deposit, and you could go ahead and put a well in there, but you're not going to pump any water because the permeability is too slow to provide any water for your use. But it's still the water table. Now, that water table, because it's close to the land surface, is impacted by the activities that are occurring on the land. So whether it's agriculture and an application of fertilizers and so forth, which would generate nitrate concentrations, or it's like the issue we started with contamination by industrialization and so forth, where you get groundwater contamination by petroleum or chlorinated solvents. It's still contamination of the groundwater.
So I originally started off with the idea that if you draw down the Jordan aquifer as an example, it takes a long time to recharge it is that true or not? I mean, are we talking decades, hundreds of,
Yes.
That's what I thought. Okay, good. I want to make sure that I get all these things in. I have these slides here. Now, as I mentioned, I've got this kind of love-hate relationship with the Register, but, they've been covering it pretty well, and they published the Doc's op-ed here. It says, Iowa needs a plan for using its precious groundwater. And this just appeared. A groundwater plan would produce a water budget for the major aquifers of Iowa, Jordan first and foremost, but there are other aquifers, as we talked about. It reads, droughts occur on average about once per decade in Iowa, and current drought was preceded by droughts in 2012, 2000, 1988, 89, and beyond. Less rainfall during drought reduces the infiltration recharge, we've been talking about that, to shallow groundwater, lowers water table levels, and reduces groundwater discharge as base flow to rivers and streams. Again, explain that, Doc. So I didn't realize that, I guess, that the rivers and streams, when they're low, like the graphic that I showed at the beginning, and like the Raccoon River here, I mean, look at that. I mean, that's supposed to be discharging into the aquifers?
No, in this case, in most cases in Iowa, groundwater is feeding that river. That's not surface water entering groundwater. That's groundwater
Ah,
discharging into the stream. So
okay.
if you go down to a stream like during this current drought, it hasn't rained in 2 months, and yet there's still water in the stream. That's because groundwater is seeping into the sides and the bed of that channel and causing that water flow. That's what we call base flow. Surface
I
water
see.
runoff, when that flows across the land, that causes the stream levels to rise and fall quickly. That's surface water runoff. So you get a stream, it's composed of those two parts: the groundwater seepage as base flow and overland surface water runoff. So during drought, the entire rivers are supplied by the groundwater level, so as base flow. So if you look into Iowa Stream, you know, roughly 50 to 60% of the annual stream flow exported from that watershed is coming from groundwater, from the water table and the
Mm.
discharge of base flow.
All right, that clears that up. Uh, Now, drought conditions invariably increase the demands for agricultural crop irrigation, and many communities find that water use increases during drought from lawn watering and other outdoor water uses. In addition, new and increasing pumping demands from a rapidly urbanizing population, ethanol plants, and other industrial facilities, data centers that require those vast quantities of cooling water that we talked about, animal confinement, and other uses are challenging urban and rural water systems to keep groundwater supplies on pace with demand. And here's this Danielle Eller wrote this article: drier than the Dust Bowl, Iowa faces more drought, preps for water shortages. And this article goes on and on. I don't want to read too much here, Doc, but I guess I would ask you the question. Now, as a geologist, and you're looking at this, and we talked about those uses for ethanol and car washes and lawn watering and that type of thing, and the issues with recharging the aquifers and where we get our water, good, clean, pure drinking water, which is becoming increasingly valuable. As part of the water plan that you're talking about, thinking about using, gray waters and that type of thing for some of those purposes.
It certainly could. A little background. So we do have, at a couple times over the last 50 years, the state has invested in what I would call a water plan. And that water plan includes precipitation and runoff and all the aspects of water cycle in Iowa. The last best comprehensive plan, a water plan, was in 1978. Then there was kind of an update in 85. There's really been nothing since that time.
Wow.
So I have tried to generate interest in a water plan, a more comprehensive thing. And in this case, in this editorial, kind of failing to generate the interest I wanted in a water plan, I said, well, at least I'm going to focus on the stuff that directly impacts what I do. So I said, Iowa needs a groundwater plan, if nothing else, because droughts are common. Like I said, every 10 years or so, we're going to have another major drought. And folks are going to look on the crystal ball and say, you know what? I think irrigation would really help get through these areas. Or it gets really dry in August. I think irrigation would be great. And the next thing you know, we've got a lot of new irrigation starting, and we're withdrawing from a limited resource, and we're depleting that aquifer, especially the more shallow stuff, across vast areas. And not to be all doom and gloom, but the last thing you want to do is be the next Ogallala aquifer, where we've depleted our resource so much it's not available anymore. So I don't think, and you got the Jordan up here again, I don't think the Jordan is not the one that's going to be most vulnerable to drought or even irrigation, because it's just so deep. So the issues related to the Jordan are definitely its water use and from big users. So that's a slightly different issue than the drought impacts, which are going to impact alluvial sand and gravel bodies and so forth more so. The Jordan and the deep aquifers are impacted because everybody wants more water during a drought because it's dry. So the the rate of depletion increases. But for this groundwater plan that I was talking about, it was this idea that we could take the Iowa groundwater system, divide it up into different aquifers and different local regions of the state, and say, like I said before, how much water is available. That means knowing something about the extent of the aquifer, the shape, the configuration, the permeability, how much is recharged, and where's it going. It could discharge to a stream, it could discharge to a public utility. I don't care, but like that water is leaving the system. So we need to know the the volume, and how much is leaving. And if you know that, then you get a chance to plan accordingly and say, all right, are we matching our uses with how much is being recharged? You know, like if you don't know that, all you're doing is assigning, permits to discharge or irrigation or whatever, without knowing how much is there and how much is entering on a annual, multi-decadal scale.
You know, I thought I had the chart available. I can't find it right now. I did see a usage chart of what the water is being used for. Irrigation is increasing in the state of Iowa, probably because of these drought-stricken areas that we've talked about. And then I'm always amazed at how much water is used for utilities, power utilities, ethanol, cooling, and that type of thing. Is that usage sustainable? Or now ethanol is supposed to phase out here eventually, but does that concern you?
Well, the current assumption is it takes about 3 gallons of water to make a gallon of ethanol. So, more ethanol, more water use. And the thing with some of these ethanol plants is they were not necessarily sited and located where the most water is available for use. So in some cases, they've located these plants to be near corn production, but they're not in an area that has a lot of sustainable groundwater. So then they end up pulling the water from the deep Jordan aquifer, again, which is a one-time use to make ethanol, and then they'll, discharge that water to the stream. So I framed it this way one time, where I said, we're mining one fossil resource to preserve another, so we're mining old groundwater to preserve, oil and so forth in another area. It's like, because you're mining that water, if you get in that Jordan aquifer and that water is 1 million years old, you got one use at it and it's gone.
Yeah. So, mining water. I never thought of it that way. That's what we're talking about, folks. Let me see here. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss something here. We're talking about that. The highlighting here is mine for alluvial aquifer. Okay. I love the sound of that, alluvial. What is an alluvial aquifer, Doc? What is that?
That's just the sand and gravel that lines a lot of our stream valleys. Oh. So rivers will erode material, and a lot of the fines, the silt and clay, gets carried down because it's suspended. What's left behind is a lot of sand and gravel. So over time, glacial periods and so forth, we get these accumulations of sand and gravel deposits in our along our river systems. So when people settled across the Midwest, I mean, those were the areas they had surface water. And then it didn't take a whole lot of effort to plunk down shallow, say less than 50-foot wells in this sand and gravel alluvium and have all the water they needed. So this is the nice thing. It's like it can be a great source of water, but because it's so shallow, it tends to be vulnerable to contamination. So there's kind of like a, yin and yang associated with these alluvial aquifers.
Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room now, because the stuff takes money. I mean, the plans, the action, the changes that we're talking about here, and a lot of times there is resistance on the political front because they don't want to spend money, and then they don't want to compromise their special interests. How much resistance is there, in Iowa right now politically to do something like you're recommending?
That's a tough one because, clearly the water quality side of the water cycle is hugely political. The water quantity side, it's hard to see why that has to be political, because it's all about, uh, health and well-being and economic development, all these kind of like positive vibes that you'd get from this. So um, I'm a little puzzled at some point why um, funding is kind of lacking at times for sustainable water exploration and development, because that's a win for everybody. It should not be political at all. I know there's a reluctance to kind of invest money in some of these, some of this exploration, because there's not a tangible widget that you're building, but all development at some level needs water. And so um, I feel like there should be a push to invest state resources to have a better handle on how much water is available for all users, from agriculture, irrigation, confinements to cities, development, and so forth. Like, that should be a no-brainer, non-political issue. We need to invest in it.
For sure.
In that piece that you said, you'd highlighted the Iowa Geological Survey, and that's what I'm the director of here in Iowa City. And I said that we're pretty well equipped to do this. We use a lot of methods to investigate, especially these shallow systems. We can use geophysics and map the distribution of the sand and gravel deposits. We can install monitoring wells. We have the understanding of how these deposits formed and why they're here, and why the grain size of these aquifers are different in some places than others. So I would like to see, if I get a chance to make this pitch, a real investment by the legislature to, my organization. But we cover the state. This is what we do, to actually delineate these resources for everybody. And I use the example of the Raccoon River alluvial system, where the Des Moines Waterworks is joining forces with other water systems. West Des Moines has their own thing. It was in that article, my quote was like, it's one big drink, like a big gulp that we all have here. Everybody wants to put their straw in it, and we're all sucking from the same drink. Like, we should know how much water can be sustainably used by everybody with a straw in this big drink.
That's great. I mean, this is the kind of stuff I love having on the show, because it makes it understandable. All right, let me, because we're running out of time here, let me check this last paragraph and see if there's something here. I know that I highlighted something here that I wanted to get at. Let me go. Okay, so let's see here. Bring this up big so I can see it on screen. There is a need for the state to fund the research. That's what we're talking about. Mapping and analysis needed to improve our understanding of Iowa's groundwater resources. A groundwater plan would balance the current and future needs for groundwater extraction with long-term sustainability for future generations. And the reason that I highlighted that, and we talked about it earlier, we're talking about future generations. We're talking about the future, period, which fits very well into my show, because I'm big on living. I talk about a lot of issues on this show, folks, and there's a lot of controversy out there, but this is something that we can all agree on. Water is life. We got to have it. So let's do it, Doc, and good on you for kind of leading the charge here, raising the issue, and trying to get people to, not only look down, but look underground.
Yeah, we want to think about our current immediate needs. Like, we all just want to have this, solving this problem for the now. Think about the groundwater is, depending on what part of the aquifers or systems you're in. This is you're making decisions on water use that will impact future generations and the water availability for them. So that needs to be considered. We can't just be thinking about our immediate needs and being kind of, selfish about that when we think about our kids and grandkids and so forth. You know what? They're going to have water needs too. And if we're using a resource that's not replenished every year with rainfall, there's a future element here that we need to consider. And so I don't know. I feel like sometimes there's a real disconnect on that where, it's my water for right now. It's like, yeah, in some places maybe, but in other places, no, you're making a decision that will have long-term consequences.
That's great. That's well said. I think that this is one of those places, the Heartland, that we talk about here on the show all the time. Well, I like to give my guests the last word, Doc. That was a pretty good last word
It
there. But
was. I'm not sure on top of that.
all right, great. So we'll leave it there. Well, thank you for telling us all about groundwater and the plight here, the crisis with water here in the Heartland. And we'll circle back. We'll come back to you in the future, because I got a feeling that this is a problem. I wish it would get better, but I got a feeling that this is one that's going to be with us for a while. Dr. Schilling, thanks again for coming on the Podcast by George live line.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, we're having a little, looks like a little internet freeze here this morning. So I'm going to bring me back up on screen, full screen here. Hopefully this will still work. Come on, George. There we are. No, it's slow. There it is. Okay. Don't know what we're doing here with the internet, but hopefully this is streamed all right. I know the audio usually is pretty good, even if the video does stall once in a while. But I'll tell people at this point that if you like seeing Dr. Keith Schilling, the state geologist and director of the Iowa Geological Survey, on Podcast by George, talking about the all-critical issue of fresh, drinkable, livable water, subscribe to Podcast by George. Sign up to Facebook and on YouTube, where you can see these live video streams. You can do that at podcastbygeorge.com. It's very easily done there. Just pick the Facebook and the YouTube badges, and you'll be in. It'll take you right there when you can subscribe, like, give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, and then, of course, share the show so that it gets around. And if you like the audio-only versions, you can also sign up at podcastbygeorge.com on Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, of course, iTunes. All of those places are also at podcastbygeorge.com. But that's going to do it, folks. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another Podcast by George.